Hello, this is Michael Rowley. I'm going to be talking about the new ActiveVOS version 7 designer canvas. We've made substantial advances over the previous generation canvas, and I'd like to show you some of its features. But before I do, let me show you the end result. This is a Bpmn 2.0 canvas. I'm going to maximize this and look at just a simple abstract process. This is Bpmn 2.0. It's pretty easy to understand. There's circles for things that are events, either receiving events or sending events, and rounded boxes for things that are activities. You can see in this example that mostly you can follow the control flow of the process by just following the arrows. The one somewhat complex case is the for each, the parallel for each, where these things all happen in parallel, and it might get interrupted partway through by somebody requesting a stop. Now this process, even though it's represented using Bpmn 2.0, it is still a WS Beeple 2.0 process. You switch to the source view, you still see that. But we hide a lot of the details. All of the details necessary for Beeple are there, but they're not shown on the screen in a way that gets in the way of understanding the process. Let me show you this exact same process using the previous generation of the designer. You can see in this that all of the constructs in Beeple, everywhere there's a sequence, there's a bounding box. Everywhere there's an if condition or a else, everything is represented with a bounding box with an icon at the top. This makes it nice and consistent, but the result is a set of nested bounding boxes that can make it very difficult to follow what's going on. When you use a notation like this, it takes it up a level of abstraction. It's more likely that you're going to be able to show this to a non-developer and collaborate with them to get your work done. So let me go to working with this new designer. I'm going to start with a new process. Let's call it test 1, for example. And let me first tour the canvas. I'm going to make my palette a little wider. I tend to like having a wider palette. It allows me to see more of my icons at once. There are a number of drawers on this palette. A new drawer for 7.0 is the event drawer. So what Beeple considers activities are represented in Bpmn either as activities, these bounding boxes, or events, which are circles. We still have the control flow of the higher level concept containers that are represented in Beeple. And then we have a drawer for handlers that can be dropped onto scopes. And then finally one for general drawing and labeling on the diagram that has no semantic meaning to the process. So one of the first advances, I'm going to just drop this invoke onto the screen, is that we can type a long description with spaces into the process. So in the past we've had to use no spaces. An NC name is what Beeple called it. We now can type arbitrary spaces, and we can type, put it with question marks and parens and dashes. And what we do is we remove the illegal characters as far as Beeple is concerned, and we turn spaces into underscores, so you can make much more sense of your drawing. The next thing that is really important that people understand is when you're putting your second activity onto the diagram and you want it to be linked to the first, don't just put it at an arbitrary place on the diagram and draw a new line between them. We've got a little shortcut. Anytime you drag a new thing right up next to the previous one, it will automatically create a little structure and draw the line between them. So I'll add another one. And you can see when I mouse over it, I'm getting this little structured area here that really you can manipulate as a whole. You can move this thing around the canvas, for example. Now let me show you the use of some of the control flow we've got. I'm going to add an if statement into this. Now you see that I'm not in Bpmn just adding individual gateways and individual lines. I'm drawing the entire construct, and I can put things into that construct by moving them around very easily. I can put something after it. By doing this style, by not having to draw the individual lines, it really raises the level of productivity. I can do something similar with, say, pick. I'll put a pick in here. Now if I decide that this if actually belongs in the pick, it's really as simple as moving it from one place to another, and then I can add more activities into the on alarm section of the pick, and I can put an if into that. In each case, watch carefully what I'm doing. When I drag, I've got this horizontal line in potential places I can add it, above or below this, above or below that. I can add it at the beginning of this area for the on alarm, or at the end of it. I can drag it into the area of each, the if or the else. So I'm getting these clues as to where I can drag the activities. When you want to put a condition on an if, you'll select the area around the condition and double click on it, and you can put the condition into it. If you want to add another condition on your if, so you've got 2 or 3 different conditions, you do that with right clicking on the if and clicking on add, and then you can drag more activities into it. So this is a huge advance. You saw I just moved something all the way across, or move this if outside of it and delete the entire pick. The productivity that you get this way is so dramatic in comparison to having to do all manipulation by hand. So let me show you next the repeat until. So here, repeat until is another activity where we represent it without a bounding box, just a backward arrow. In Bpmn, the most natural way to represent something that you need to repeat something, I just stuck the if inside the repeat until, is to go backward. So we treat that as an entire construct. And then here again, the way you insert into it is in above or below one of these structured areas, one of the sequences that is inside of the if. If I double click on the if itself, on the condition itself, I can add the condition for the repeat until. The next thing that I'd like to show you is that you can use, because we're laying this thing out, you can move any of these coarse grain things to use a horizontal notation, a horizontal alignment. Oftentimes it's traditional in a Bpmn notation to do a left to right layout. Now when I'm inserting things, I'm getting, instead of the horizontal line, I'm getting a vertical line in places I can add them. For the repeat until, I've got an additional thing, which is I can switch. I can make it return on the bottom side instead of the top side. Or if I were to make this whole thing vertical again, it's also can be either top side or left side. You can switch which side the arrow goes back on. This let me switch back to the horizontal, and let me just show you all of these bounding, these blue circled areas, or bounded areas I'm talking about. Each of these structured areas is where you can have the system do your layout for you. But you notice there's also this whole area that's not part of that, that blue bounds. If you drop anything inside of that area, you get a new a new structured area. Even a solitary activity like this, if you mouse over it, you can see there's a new little blue box around it. So if I create two of them and I drop them each into the freeform area, they each will be starting a new structured area. If I want to expand on that structured area, I'll drop things just above or just below each of them. So to generalize, the canvas is a set of structured areas where each structured area is laid out by the system, and the areas between the structured areas are laid out by the user. This is getting a little busy, so I'll delete a few things. I'd like to next show you events. Now, events sometimes are events that can play multiple roles. Let me start with this thing called the start and none event. It's very odd. In Bpmn it's called none event. In Beeple it's just an empty activity. Bpmn suggests, almost requires, but it's not strictly required, that everything start with a start event and an end event, but they don't have semantics. So you use that same none event, what will be an empty in Beeple, and depending on where you put it, it will be either a start, an intermediate, or an end event. So this, if I moved it up here, it has two circles around it, which means it's an end event, an intermediate event. When I put it back to the end, it's an end event. If I create a new structured area, the first one is a beginning event, and this next one is an end event. If I then draw a link between them, the two of these events become intermediate events, as you'd expect. For other kinds of events, Bpmn says they can play multiple roles. So, for example, receive is allowed to be a start event or an intermediate event, but it can't be an end event. So as a result, depending on where you put it, if you put the receive somewhere in the middle, it will be shown with two circles, which means it's an intermediate event. If you put it at the beginning, it's an end event. I mean, it's a start event. If you put it at the end, it's still an intermediate event because there's no such thing as a receive. You're not allowed to have a receive end event. Reply is kind of symmetric, but the opposite. It's allowed to be an intermediate event or an end event. So I put it here, it's an intermediate event. I put it over here, and it's an end event. It's common with like a synchronous process that the process will start with the receive and end with the reply. There are other kinds of events that are necessarily end events. So if you put in if you put in an exit, it will always show as an end event. Now these things also affect these events that can be end events also affect the way that we draw ifs. So I had shown you before an if. Here, let me get rid of this. An if that was drawn with both a split and a merge at the end, and then we put some activities inside of it. But you know, frequently there's nothing to do after you remerge the two sides of the if and the else. If you're done, you can put an else. You can put something that can be an end event on each path, and it will remove the merge diamond. And it does this recursively with our other structured activity as well, which is the pick. So if you have a pick, and you have an if in it. Now that if, you can see, ends with two things that can be merged, end events, but it isn't. But this last one, this on alarm, doesn't have an end event in it. Now if I drop something in that can be an end event, like reply can be an end event, it will remove the merges from the ifs and the remerges from the picks. So it will act recursively, saying in general, if there is a period at the end of every sentence, if there is an end at the end of every path on something that is a tree, then it won't rejoin the tree into merges, but just create end events on each branch of the tree. And that form tends to be easier to look at, easier to work with, and so people often prefer it. Let me show you next how you would do some of this stuff with when you're working with multiple structured areas. When you're doing that, you will sometimes use gateways by hand. So here's a gateway that is showing without anything inside of it, which means it's an exclusive gateway. So I can get the equivalent of an if by, and actually I think I will start from scratch here and say, do a start event. And I could, if I wanted to do everything with my own layout, which I don't recommend, but it is possible, I can drag in a gateway, I can drag in another gateway, I can drag in the activities that I want to have on either side of it, and then I can start using links to line these things up. For example. Now, the disadvantage of this is when you start wanting to work with changing it, putting things into another, you'd rather this be outside of it, you'd rather it be up here instead. You know, in the structured approach, you would just be able to move it, it would go above the gateway, and you wouldn't have to fix up any arrows. When you do it everything by hand, you're always fixing things up by hand. These gateways come in a variety of forms. They can be inclusive, exclusive, which I just showed, inclusive, which means that more than one of the paths could be taken on the way out, parallel, meaning all of the paths will be taken on the way out, or complex, and complex isn't actually relevant for a split. It's more relevant for a join. So this could be a complex gateway. And it's only when you have a complex gateway that you get the possibility of creating a join condition. I think complex gateways are unlikely to be used very frequently. So let me next show you what we call bordered activities. Now, I showed repeat until before, and that the repeat until was done by showing the two diamonds in a structured area where you had you never got a boundary around anything. You got the line that goes back, but you didn't get a boundary. It's really more difficult to do that for a while, because the while checks whether or not to enter the loop at the beginning, and it becomes awkward. So there's a different representation in Bpmn, which is to draw a new bounding box, and then just for this whole area, and then put a little loop around it which says it's a while. You can double click on that to do your while condition. That's one example of a bounded activity. Another example of a bounded activity is a scope. So, and a scope is it's called a subprocess, an embedded subprocess in Bpmn, but people knows it as a scope. You can continue using these structured concepts to insert new things into the scope, and it will grow appropriately. The bounding box around it will grow appropriately. Now, scopes also have the ability to get handlers. So we've got this entire drawer for handlers, like catch expressions. What you do with handlers is you drag the handler onto the scope, and it goes into the unbounded area for the scope. So I'm going to move this a little bit. What I can do is I can resize the scope. If you click on the scope, and by the way, when you're clicking on various things, you need to be careful about when you're clicking on the structured area, which is covered in blue, or the activity within it, which this one is just barely within it. The scopes are resizable, and by resizing this scope, I can put activities into the unstructured area of the scope, and I can also put handlers into the unstructured area of the scope. And I can auto layout the scope, and it'll give a suggestion for how it might lay out. So just as the main canvas is multiple structured areas inside of an unstructured canvas, each scope is also multiple structured areas. Here's one structured area. I can create another structured area by sticking a couple things, a receive, and maybe a horizontal structured area, for example, or I could make it vertical. Inside of a scope, the scope boundaries, and I can just make it big enough to work with that. Another thing that is new in 7.0 is you can collapse a scope. You'd always been able to collapse containers. So now that scope is collapsed. What's new in 7.0 is that in order to see what's there, you don't have to expand it in place. Expanding it in place can be a pain because all of the things around it have to move to get out of the way, and sometimes you just want to see it without actually changing the diagram that it's on. Right now, if you hit plus, what it does is it drills in and it goes to the definition of the scope. And then you get a breadcrumb across the top to see where you are. If I added another scope to this, a control flow on another scope, and maybe stick a bunch of stuff inside of that and then collapse that, and then I can go into that scope and I get more in the breadcrumbs, and then I can work my way back up again by just drilling my way out. So those are some of the techniques for using this new canvas. I hope you find, as I have, that it's a much more productive way of working with a process model than anything that's come before. And let us know what you think.